The morning I found Karen Henderson standing on my property with a tape measure and a clipboard, I knew my peaceful retirement at Pine Lake was about to become a war zone. What I didn't know was that her petty crusade against my deck would accidentally launch the most successful lakeside restaurant this county had ever seen. My name is David, and 3 years ago, I bought what I thought was my dream cabin on Pine Lake, a gorgeous 2-bedroom log home with 200 feet of pristine shoreline. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Frank, had built a beautiful wraparound deck that faced the water. It was nothing fancy, just weathered cedar planks and sturdy railings, where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the mist rise off the lake. The cabin came with something else I hadn't bargained for: membership in the Pine Lake Homeowners Association, and more specifically, its self-appointed enforcer, Karen Henderson. Karen lived in the largest house on the lake, a gaudy McMansion that looked like someone had dropped a suburban palace into the middle of the wilderness. She drove a white Escalade with custom plates that read HOA Karen, even though she wasn't actually the president. That honor belonged to a mild-mannered retiree named Bob, but everyone knew Karen pulled the strings. The first time I met Karen was at the annual HOA meeting in the community center. She wore a cream-colored blazer and carried a leather portfolio thick enough to choke a horse. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it could have been mistaken for a facelift. "You must be the new owner of the Morrison place," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Karen Henderson, compliance coordinator for the Pine Lake HOA." I shook her hand and immediately regretted it. Her grip was like a vise, and her smile didn't reach her pale blue eyes. "Nice to meet you," I said. "Beautiful area. I'm looking forward to being part of the community." "Oh, I'm sure you are." She flipped through her portfolio. "I've been meaning to stop by. There are a few items we need to discuss regarding your property." The way she said items made my stomach drop, but I smiled and nodded, still naive enough to think we were just making friendly conversation. That conversation ended with Karen handing me a 3-page document titled Pine Lake HOA Architectural Guidelines and Compliance Standards. She pointed to several highlighted sections with her perfectly manicured nail. "Just some light reading," she said with that plastic smile. "I'm sure you'll find it fascinating." But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered when I actually read those guidelines. The trap. 3 days later, I was sitting on my deck with the morning paper and a steaming mug of coffee when I heard the distinctive crunch of gravel in my driveway. Through the pine trees, I caught a glimpse of white paint and chrome Karen's Escalade. My peaceful morning evaporated like the mist over the lake. Karen emerged from her vehicle, wearing a different blazer navy this time, and carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. She had a young man with her, probably her son, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Good morning, David," she called out in a voice so artificially cheerful it could have sweetened artificial sweetener. "Gorgeous day, isn't it?" I set down my coffee and walked to the edge of the deck. "Morning, Karen. What brings you by?" She gestured to her equipment. "Oh, just doing some routine compliance checks. You know how it is keeping the community standards up for everyone's benefit." The young man who I learned was indeed her son, Tyler, began unfolding a measuring tape that looked long enough to survey a small county. Karen pulled out her clipboard and started making notes. "I hope you don't mind," she continued, "but I've had some concerns brought to my attention regarding your deck structure." "Concerns?" I felt my jaw tighten. "What kind of concerns?" Karen's smile faltered just slightly, replaced by the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. "Well, David, according to the Pine Lake HOA Guidelines Section 4.2, Subsection C, all deck structures are limited to a maximum of 400 square feet without special architectural approval." She gestured broadly at my deck, which wrapped around 2 sides of the cabin like a wooden hug. "Tyler, Honey, let's get some measurements. For the next 20 minutes, I watched Karen and her reluctant son stretch their tape measure across every inch of my deck. Karen called out numbers, while Tyler dutifully wrote them down, occasionally shooting me apologetic looks. The sounds of their measuring, the metallic snap of the tape retracting, Karen's sharp voice calling out dimensions created a rhythm of impending doom that made my chest tighten. "Well," Karen announced finally, consulting her clipboard with obvious satisfaction, "it looks like we have a problem." "And what problem is that?" "Your deck measures 847 square feet. That's more than double the allowable size." She looked up at me with those cold blue eyes. "I'm afraid you're going to need to remove approximately 450 square feet to bring it into compliance." The morning air suddenly felt thin. I gripped the deck railing so hard my knuckles went white. "Karen, this deck was built by the previous owner. It's been here for over 15 years. Surely there's some kind of grandfather clause." "Oh no, David." She shook her head with mock sympathy. "The guidelines were updated just 2 years ago. All existing structures have a 5-year compliance window. You inherited that obligation when you purchased the property." She handed me an official-looking document with the HOA letterhead. "You have 30 days to submit architectural modification plans showing how you'll bring the structure into compliance. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $100 until the violation is corrected." Tyler finished packing up their equipment and headed for the Escalade, clearly eager to escape. Karen lingered for a moment, savoring her victory. "I know it seems harsh, David, but rules are rules. We can't have everyone just building whatever they want, can we? Property values depend on consistency." She turned to leave, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. "Oh, and David? I'd recommend getting started on those modifications right away. 30 days goes by faster than you think." As the Escalade disappeared down the gravel road, I stood on my supposedly oversized deck, looking out at the lake that had brought me so much peace just an hour earlier. But what Karen didn't know was that her little measurement exercise had given me an idea. And what happened next would make her regret ever pulling out that tape measure. That afternoon, I drove into town to the Pine Lake Municipal Building, a modest brick structure that housed everything from the mayor's office to the dog catcher. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Mary Sullivan, the town clerk, was a silver-haired woman in her 60s who'd lived in Pine Lake her entire life. She knew everyone, everything, and most importantly, she had no love for Karen Henderson. "Let me guess," Mary said, when I explained my situation. "Karen's on another compliance crusade. You've seen this before?" Mary laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Honey, Karen has terrorized half the lake with that clipboard of hers. Last month, she tried to force the Petersons to remove their bird feeder because it wasn't architecturally consistent with the neighborhood aesthetic." She pulled out a thick file folder labeled Pine Lake HOA Correspondence. "The thing about Karen," Mary continued, lowering her voice, "is that she knows just enough about HOA law to be dangerous, but not quite enough to avoid stepping in it." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Well, for starters, that compliance coordinator title she loved so much. It doesn't actually exist in your HOA's bylaws. She made it up." Mary flipped through several documents. "The real authority lies with the elected board president, Bob Martinez, and he's never authorized half the compliance actions Karen takes." This was interesting, but it didn't solve my immediate problem. "What about the deck situation? Is there anything I can do?" Mary's eyes lit up. "Now that's where it gets fun. Let me show you something." She pulled out a large plat map of Pine Lake and spread it across the counter. The lake was roughly circular, surrounded by dozens of properties marked in different colors. "See these red properties? Those are the original lots from when Pine Lake was first developed in 1987. The green ones were added in Phase 2, 1994, and the blue ones, including yours, were Phase 3, completed in 2001. She tapped my property with her finger. Your cabin sits on what used to be 3 separate lots before they were combined. The HOA guidelines, Karen loves to quote, they only apply to structures built after the lot consolidation in 2003. My pulse quickened. So my deck predates the guidelines? Not only that, Mary said with a grin, but according to the county records, your deck was actually built with the commercial permits. Commercial? Why would a residential deck need commercial permits? Mary's grin widened. Because Frank Morrison, the guy you bought from, originally planned to open a small lakeside cafe. He got all the proper zoning, health department approvals, everything. The only reason he never opened was because his wife got sick and he had to focus on caregiving. She pulled out another document, the original permit application from 2008. According to this, your property is zoned for mixed residential and commercial use. That deck of yours? It's technically approved as an outdoor dining area for up to 60 patrons. The implications hit me like lightning. So if I wanted to open a restaurant? Mary's eyes twinkled. Honey, all you'd need to do is reactivate the permits and pass a health inspection. Karen's HOA guidelines don't override county zoning laws. I stared at the documents, my mind racing. Karen wanted me to cut my deck in half? Fine, but she was about to learn that sometimes, when you back someone into a corner, they don't just fight back, they fight smart. But first, I had to deal with her next move. Because knowing Karen, this was just the opening salvo in what was about to become an all-out war. 5 days later, I found an official-looking envelope in my mailbox, the kind with return address labels that scream LAGALCORE, ESPONDENCE in intimidating font. Inside was a letter on Pine Lake HOA letterhead, signed by Karen in her self-proclaimed role as compliance coordinator. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. It referenced sections and subsections of the HOA guidelines, quoted property value studies, and included phrases like willful noncompliance and legal remedies available to the association. The final paragraph made my blood pressure spike. Please be advised that failure to begin modification of the non-compliant deck structure within the next 14 days will result in the association pursuing all available legal remedies, including, but not limited to, daily fines, liens against the property, and forced compliance through architectural modification at the homeowner's expense. Attached was an estimate from Karen's preferred contractor, her brother-in-law's company, coincidentally for $8,500, to surgically remove excess decking while maintaining structural integrity. I called Bob Martinez, the actual HOA president, immediately. David, I'm so sorry about this, Bob said when I read him the letter. I've talked to Karen repeatedly about overstepping her authority, but she insists she's protecting property values. Bob, do you actually want me to cut my deck in half? There was a long pause. Honestly. Your deck is one of the most beautiful features on the lake. It's been there forever, and it's never bothered anyone except Karen. But she's got the guidelines on her side, and she's threatening to call for a special board meeting if I don't back her up. What if I told you there might be another solution? I explained what Mary Sullivan had discovered about the commercial zoning and the original permits. Bob was quiet for so long I thought we'd lost connection. David, are you seriously considering opening a restaurant? I'm considering all my options. Another long pause. You know what? If you can pull this off legally, you have my blessing. Karen's been terrorizing this community for too long. Maybe it's time someone showed her that her little rule book isn't the final word on everything. That evening, I sat on my supposedly oversized deck with a yellow legal pad, sketching out ideas. The deck was perfect for outdoor dining, it caught the morning sun, had gorgeous lake views, and was positioned to capture the breeze off the water. More importantly, it would drive Karen absolutely insane. I was deep in thought when headlights swept across my driveway. A white Escalade parked next to my truck, and Karen emerged wearing what appeared to be her most intimidating blazer black with military-style buttons. "David, I hope you got my letter," she called out as she marched toward the deck. I did. Very thorough. She climbed the steps with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. "I wanted to stop by personally to make sure you understand the seriousness of your situation." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Karen pulled out her ever-present clipboard. "I've taken the liberty of scheduling a compliance inspection for next Friday. If the necessary modifications haven't begun by then, the fines will start accumulating immediately." She looked around the deck with obvious distaste, as if its very existence was a personal affront. "I know this seems harsh, David, but someone has to maintain standards. If we let one person ignore the guidelines, soon everyone will think they can do whatever they want." "You're absolutely right, Karen. Rules are important." She looked surprised by my agreement. "Well, yes, exactly. That's why I've been doing some research of my own." I pulled out copies of the documents Mary had shown me: the zoning permits, the commercial approvals, the county records. Karen's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as she scanned the papers. "What is this?" "It's the original permit for this deck. Turns out it's approved for commercial use as an outdoor dining area. County zoning supersedes HOA guidelines." Karen's face went through several color changes: confusion, realization, anger, and finally, a shade of red I'd never seen on a human being. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. In fact, I've already contacted the health department about reactivating the permits." "David, you cannot turn your deck into a restaurant." The word came out like a curse. "The noise, the traffic, the people. Actually, I can. And according to the original permits, I can serve up to 60 patrons." Karen gripped her clipboard so tightly, I thought she might snap it in half. "This is ridiculous. I'll fight this." "You're welcome to try." "But Karen?" I smiled at her the same way she'd smiled at me during that first HOA meeting. "Rules are rules." As her Escalade disappeared into the night, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. But I also knew this was far from over. Karen Henderson didn't strike me as someone who accepted defeat gracefully. What I didn't realize was that she was already planning her next move, one that would force me to commit to this restaurant idea whether I was ready or not. The escalation. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise. A white van from Henderson Property Management parked at the end of my driveway, effectively blocking my access to the road. Karen's brother-in-law, Rick, sat in the driver's seat with a thermos of coffee and a newspaper, clearly prepared for a long stay. I walked down to the van and tapped on the window. Rick rolled it down with obvious reluctance. "Morning, Rick." "What's going on?" "Sorry, David. Karen hired me to monitor compliance activities on the property. I'm supposed to document any commercial development that violates HOA residential zoning restrictions." "By blocking my driveway?" Rick shrugged. "I'm on the county easement. Technically legal." I looked at the van, then at Rick's uncomfortable expression. Karen was escalating faster than I'd expected. "Rick, you know this is ridiculous, right? Look, I just do what my sister-in-law pays me to do. She's convinced you're planning to turn the whole lake into some kind of commercial district." He gestured toward my cabin. "Says you're going to have buses full of tourists, loud music, drunken parties." "It's a lakeside cafe, Rick. Coffee and sandwiches, maybe some evening dining." Not a nightclub. But Rick just shrugged again and rolled up his window. Over the next 3 days, Rick maintained his vigil at the end of my driveway. Karen had found a legal loophole. He wasn't actually trespassing, and he wasn't preventing me from leaving. He was just making it incredibly inconvenient and sending a message to the entire neighborhood. The message worked. By Wednesday, I'd received calls from 5 different neighbors, all asking about my restaurant plans with varying degrees of concern and curiosity. Mrs. Patterson from across the lake was worried about parking issues. The Johnsons were concerned about noise ordinances. But surprisingly, several neighbors were actually intrigued by the idea of having a local restaurant within walking distance. "We've been driving 20 miles to town every time we want a decent meal," said Jim Peterson during one phone call. "A nice lakeside place would be wonderful as long as it's done right." The flames shot 30 feet into the Texas sky, casting dancing shadows across my 100-acre ranch, while 3 fire departments stood by with their arms crossed, legally powerless to stop me. Karen Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, stood at my property line, screaming into her cell phone, her face redder than the glowing embers floating past her perfectly manicured lawn. What started as a simple bonfire tradition had become the most expensive middle finger in state history. The beginning. Let me back up 6 months to when this whole mess started. I'm Jake Morrison, and I just inherited my grandfather's ranch outside Austin, 100 acres of rolling hills, mesquite trees, and the kind of wide-open freedom that makes your soul breathe easier. The property had been in our family for 3 generations, long before the suburban sprawl crept in like kudzu on a fence post. My grandfather used to throw legendary bonfires every fall. Half the county would show up with their trucks, coolers full of beer, and stories that got taller with each telling. The fire pit sat in the middle of a cleared field, surrounded by nothing but pasture and stars. It was a tradition as sacred as Sunday church and twice as healing for the spirit. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in September. I was fixing a section of fence when I heard the click-clack of high heels on gravel. Now, you don't hear high heels much on a working ranch, so I looked up to see a woman in a cream-colored pantsuit, picking her way across my driveway like she was navigating a minefield. "Excuse me," she called out in that particular tone that wealthy women use when they're about to ruin your day. "Are you the new owner?" "That would be me," I said, setting down my wire cutters and wiping my hands on my jeans. "Jake Morrison. What can I do for you?" She extended a manicured hand that felt like shaking hands with a mannequin. "Karen Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. I live in the development just over the ridge." She gestured toward the cluster of identical McMansions that had sprouted up like mushrooms on what used to be the Henderson family farm. "Congratulations," I said, though I wasn't sure why anyone would want credit for that eyesore. Karen's smile had all the warmth of a tax audit. "I wanted to introduce myself and discuss some concerns the community has about your activities here." "Activities?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean ranching? On my ranch?" "Well, specifically the bonfires." She pulled out a manila folder thick as a phone book. "We've done some research, and according to county ordinances, there are strict regulations about open burning that haven't been properly observed." I felt my jaw clench. "Ma'am, my family's been having bonfires on this land since before your neighborhood was even a twinkle in some developer's eye. We've never had a single problem." "Times change, Mr. Morrison." Karen's voice carried the condescending patience of someone explaining basic math to a 5-year-old. The Meadowbrook Hills community represents a significant investment in property values. Smoke, noise, and the type of people these gatherings attract can be quite disruptive to our peaceful environment. The way she said "type of people" made my blood pressure spike. "You mean my friends and neighbors?" Folks who've lived here longer than your plastic playground has existed? I'm simply trying to prevent any misunderstandings. She handed me a thick packet of papers. These are copies of all relevant fire codes, noise ordinances, and zoning restrictions. I've highlighted the sections that apply to your situation. I trust you'll review them carefully before planning any future events. I glanced at the packet without taking it. And if I don't? Karen's smile turned sharp enough to cut glass. Then I'll be forced to file formal complaints with the appropriate authorities. The county takes fire safety very seriously, especially with the drought conditions we've been experiencing. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Morrison? The fall bonfire season is almost here. I'd hate for anyone to get surprised by unexpected visits from code enforcement. As her Mercedes picked its way back down my gravel drive, I stood there holding that damn packet, feeling like someone had just thrown a bucket of cold water on a warm day. But what I didn't know was that Karen had already made 3 phone calls before she'd even reached the main road. First escalation. 2 weeks later, I decided to test the waters with a small fire. Nothing fancy, just me, my cousin Danny, and his teenage son roasting marshmallows on a Friday night. We'd barely gotten the kindling started when I saw headlights bouncing down my driveway. The deputy sheriff's cruiser pulled up next to my fire pit, and out stepped Deputy Rodriguez, a guy I'd known since high school. "Hey, Jake," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to bother you, but I got a call about an illegal burn." "Illegal?" I gestured at our modest campfire. "Miguel, this thing's smaller than what most people have in their backyard fire bowls." Miguel looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I know, man. But someone called in a complaint about smoke drifting into the Meadowbrook development. Possible fire hazard, the whole 9 yards. I got to check it out, you know." Danny spat into the fire, making it hiss. "Let me guess, tall blonde lady with a stick up her rear end?" "I can't say who made the complaint," Miguel said diplomatically. "But Jake, you might want to be extra careful about following all the fire regulations. There's been a lot of pressure from the county commissioners lately about wildfire prevention." He handed me a citation, not a ticket, just a warning, and shook his head. "Between you and me, this is the smallest illegal burn I've ever been called out to investigate. But someone's got their eye on you, amigo." After Miguel left, Danny and I sat in silence for a while, watching our pathetic little fire struggle against the evening breeze. "You know what this is about, right?" Danny finally said. "Property values. Those folks in the Plastic Castle development don't want anything that reminds them they're living next to actual Texas." "I know," I said, but my mind was already working. "Hand me that packet Karen gave me." I spent the next 3 hours reading every word of fire code, zoning regulation, and county ordinance in that manila folder. Karen had been thorough, I'll give her that. She had highlighted sections about burn permits, wind conditions, proximity to structures, and a dozen other requirements that seemed designed to make outdoor fires as complicated as rocket science. But here's the thing about regulations: they're written by lawyers, and lawyers love loopholes almost as much as they love billable hours. And buried in Section 4.7.2 of the County Fire Code, I found something interesting. Recreational fires shall not exceed 3 feet in diameter unless conducted under permit as part of agricultural or land management activities on properties exceeding 50 acres in size. Agricultural activities. On my 100-acre ranch. I called my lawyer the next morning. Tom Bradley had handled my grandfather's will and knew more about agricultural law than any city slicker had a right to. "Jake," he said, after I explained the situation, "technically speaking, controlled burns for pasture management are not just legal, they're considered best practice for land stewardship. Even if I invite a few friends over to watch." Tom chuckled. "Educational demonstrations of proper burn techniques? Hell, The county extension office encourages that kind of community outreach. By Monday morning, I had filed for an agricultural burn permit for pasture management and educational demonstration purposes. The paperwork was ironclad, reviewed by both the county fire marshal and the agricultural extension office. It authorized controlled burns up to 5 acres in size, as long as proper fire breaks were maintained and weather conditions were appropriate. I was feeling pretty good about outmaneuvering Karen when I got home to find a certified letter in my mailbox. The return address made my stomach drop: Meadowbrook Hills HOA Legal Department. Second escalation. The letter was 3 pages of legal letterhead wrapped around a simple threat: cease and desist all burning activities or face a lawsuit for creating a public nuisance that violated the peaceful enjoyment of HOA property values. It was signed by some fancy law firm in downtown Austin and copied to half a dozen county officials. I was still reading when my phone rang. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice was crisp, professional, and entirely too polite. "This is Amanda Walsh from Walsh, Henderson and Associates. We represent the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. I believe you received our correspondence today? If you mean the legal threat wrapped in fancy paper, then yes." "It's not a threat, Mr. Morrison. It's a courtesy notification of our intent to seek injunctive relief if you continue activities that negatively impact our clients' property values and quality of life." "Quality of life?" I could hear the anger creeping into my voice. "Lady, my family's been working this land since before your clients knew Texas was a state. We're not doing anything illegal. Legal and appropriate are 2 different standards, Mr. Morrison. A nuisance lawsuit doesn't require proof of illegality, only proof of unreasonable interference with others' use and enjoyment of their property. And you think a judge is going to side with a bunch of suburban transplants over a 4th-generation rancher exercising his legal rights on his own land?" There was a pause. "Mr. Morrison, litigation is expensive and time-consuming, even when you win. My clients have considerable resources at their disposal. How's your legal defense fund?" The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone like it had just bitten me. The message was clear: they might not win, but they could sure as hell bankrupt me trying to defend myself. I called Tom Bradley again. "They can file a nuisance suit," he confirmed. "Whether they can win is another matter entirely, but you're right about one thing: it'll cost you a fortune to fight, even if you come out on top." "So, what are my options?" "Well, you could comply with their demands and give up the bonfires." "Not happening." "Or you could double down and make sure any fire you light is so completely, thoroughly, and undeniably legal that they can't touch you even with a team of lawyers." "What do you mean?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Jake, what's the biggest structure fire the county's ever had to deal with?" "I don't know. Maybe that warehouse fire a few years back?" "Why?" "Because if you're going to have a bonfire, and you're going to do it under an agricultural permit on your own land for legitimate land management purposes, well, the county fire code doesn't actually specify a maximum size for agricultural burns." That night, I sat on my porch with a beer and a legal pad, sketching ideas under the glow of a Coleman lantern. Karen wanted to play hardball? Fine. But she'd picked a fight with the wrong cowboy. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and filed an amended agricultural burn permit. This one was for large-scale pasture restoration and community education demonstration, covering a designated 10-acre burn zone in the middle of my property. The fire marshal, a good old boy named Chuck, who'd known my grandfather, barely glanced at the paperwork. "Pasture restoration, huh?" he said, stamping the permit. "Your granddad always said controlled burning was the best way to clear brush and promote healthy grass growth." "Yes, sir. And I figure if I'm going to educate folks about proper burn techniques, I might as well do it right." Chuck chuckled. Just make sure you follow all the safety protocols, Jake. And maybe give us a heads up if you're planning anything ambitious." "Absolutely, sir." I was walking back to my truck when I spotted a familiar cream-colored Mercedes parked across the street from the courthouse. Karen was sitting behind the wheel, talking animatedly on her phone while watching me through oversized sunglasses. Our eyes met through her windshield. I touched the brim of my hat in a polite salute and climbed into my pickup. But as I drove away, I noticed Karen's Mercedes pulling into traffic behind me, maintaining a careful distance all the way to the hardware store. And that's when I realized this had stopped being about bonfires. Third escalation. Karen's surveillance lasted exactly 1 week. I'd spot that cream Mercedes parked on various county roads around my property, always far enough away to avoid trespassing charges, but close enough to make her presence known. It was psychological warfare, suburban style. On Thursday morning, I decided to return the favor. I loaded my truck with fence posts and wire, genuine ranch supplies for a fence repair project I'd been putting off. But instead of taking the direct route to the back pasture, I made a little detour through Meadowbrook Hills. The development was everything I'd expected: identical houses with identical lawns arranged in perfect rows, like suburban soldiers. Every mailbox was regulation black with white numbers. Every sidewalk was power washed to corporate cleanliness. It looked like a movie set for generic American Suburb, the musical. Karen's house was easy to spot. It was the biggest one on the biggest lot, with a circular driveway that screamed, "Look how important I am," and landscaping that probably cost more than most people's cars. I pulled up across the street and started making notes on a clipboard, the way contractors do when they're estimating jobs. It took less than 5 minutes for Karen to appear at her front door, arms crossed like a suburban sentinel. I waved cheerfully and drove away. The next morning, she escalated. I was welding a new gate hinge when 3 county trucks pulled into my yard: building inspector, fire marshal, and environmental services. Behind them came Karen's Mercedes and a pickup truck I didn't recognize. "Morning, Jake," said Chuck, the fire marshal, looking embarrassed. "We got complaints that you're violating multiple county codes. I got to do an inspection." "Complaints from who?" I asked, though we both knew the answer. "Anonymous citizen concerned about public safety." Chuck glanced over at Karen, who was standing next to her car with a man in an expensive suit. "This is Dave Morrison from the building department and Janet Chen from environmental services. We got to check everything: structures, burn permits, septic systems, the whole 9 yards." For the next 3 hours, they crawled over my property with tape measures, cameras, and clipboards. Karen followed at a distance, pointing out anything that looked questionable and making notes in a leather portfolio. In the end, they found exactly nothing. My permits were current, my structures were legal, my septic system was properly maintained, and my fire safety equipment exceeded county requirements. "Sorry for the hassle, Jake," Chuck said as they packed up their gear. "Everything looks good. Your agricultural burn permit is solid, and you've got better fire suppression equipment than some small towns." As the county trucks drove away, Karen approached with her companion, a tall, thin man with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that comes from charging $500 an hour. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "this is Richard Ashworth, our attorney. We wanted to discuss a possible resolution to this situation." Ashworth extended a hand that I didn't take. "Mr. Morrison, my client is prepared to make you a generous offer to resolve this matter amicably." "I am listening." "The Meadowbrook Hills HOA is willing to purchase a conservation easement on your property that would restrict open burning in exchange for fair compensation. Think of it as a good neighbor agreement." "How much?" Karen smiled like she'd just played her ace. $50,000 for a permanent easement prohibiting fires larger than standard recreational size. It was a lot of money. Enough to fix the barn roof, upgrade my equipment, and still have plenty left over. For a brief moment, I considered it. Then I looked at Karen's smug face and remembered 3 generations of Morrison family bonfires. No deal. Her smile faltered. Mr. Morrison, be reasonable. This is a generous offer for what amounts to a very small restriction on your land use. Ma'am, my grandfather didn't fight in 3 wars to preserve American freedoms so I could sell them to a suburban HOA for 50 grand. Ashworth stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, we're trying to avoid litigation here. But if you force our hand, we have extensive resources to pursue this matter through the courts. Then I guess I'll see you in court. As they walked back to their cars, I heard Karen hiss to her lawyer, I don't care what it costs. I want him stopped. But what really caught my attention was Ashworth's response. There might be another way. Let me make some calls to Austin. That evening, I got a phone call that made my blood run cold. It was Chuck the fire marshal, and he didn't sound happy. Jake, I got some bad news. The state fire marshal's office is sending inspectors down from Austin next week. Someone filed a complaint alleging you're planning a dangerously large agricultural burn without proper state oversight. But you approved my permit. County permits are one thing. If the state thinks you're planning something that could threaten life and property, they can override local authority. And Jake. The complaint specifically mentions abnormally large fire preparations and potential threat to adjacent residential areas.